At my birthday celebration, just as the orchestra shifted into a soft waltz, my mother-in-law leaned toward my husband and whispered something sharp enough to slice through the air. I saw the shift in his eyes, cold, mechanical, like a switch had been flipped. Before I could process it, his hand whipped across my face with such force that I stumbled backward, crashing onto the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the ballroom as crystal glasses trembled on their stems. For a moment, I lay there stunned, tasting iron, feeling humiliation burn through my cheeks. And then, a laugh, slow, steady, utterly foreign even to me, escaped my throat. That laugh stopped him. It stopped everyone. And though they didn't know it yet, that moment was the beginning of the Caldwell downfall. But this isn't where my story truly begins. The unraveling had started months earlier, tucked behind gilded doors and smiling photographs. Behind the facade of Boston's wealthiest family, where perfection was curated like museum pieces, I had learned to watch, quietly, carefully, until the patterns exposed themselves. Before I take you deeper into this story, thank you for being here. If you believe no woman should ever feel powerless in her own home, hit subscribe. It's free and helps us reach others who need strength, not silence. James Caldwell, my husband, hadn't always been a stranger wearing my husband's face. Once, he was warm, curious, slightly rebellious against his family's rigid traditions. But over time, under his mother Eleanor Caldwell's relentless scrutiny, his spark had dimmed, replaced by a practiced emptiness. He spoke less. He obeyed more. And he began to mirror the cold precision of the dynasty he came from. I noticed it first in the small things. He stopped laughing at my jokes. Stopped choosing his own clothes. Stopped making eye contact unless Eleanor was present. It was as though he had become an extension of her will, predictable, controlled, conditioned. And then there were the conversations I wasn't meant to hear, hushed, clipped words behind the study door, Eleanor's voice low and forceful, James's responses muted, obedient. Some nights he would sit beside me in bed, staring into nothingness, answering questions with delays that grew longer each week. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was an observer. A recorder. A woman documenting the disappearance of the man she loved, one behavioral shift at a time. But the turning point came the night I found Eleanor's private ledger tucked beneath a stack of estate documents. Hidden entries. Payments to a behavioral consultant. Notations like, trigger reinforcement successful. Emotional override stable. James responding to maternal cues. My blood chilled. Something far darker than family influence was at play. And as I stared at those words, I knew, whatever Eleanor whispered into her son's ear tonight, it wasn't love. It was programming. The night after discovering Eleanor Caldwell's hidden ledger, I lay awake beside James, listening to the steady, unnatural rhythm of his breathing. It was the breathing of someone who had been taught how to sleep, not someone who drifted into it naturally. Every rise and fall felt rehearsed, like a performance he didn't know he was giving. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the coded entries I'd read earlier that day. Trigger reinforcement. Emotional override. Compliance sessions. Words that didn't belong in any normal family, but they belonged perfectly in the Caldwell's world of control and curated perfection. Over the following weeks, I began noticing how James reacted to his mother's presence, how his spine straightened the moment she entered a room, how his eyes lost their warmth whenever she gave him a directive. At charity galas, cocktail parties, board dinners, Eleanor would whisper a phrase or lightly tap his wrist, and James's entire demeanor would shift. It was subtle, elegant even, the kind of manipulation the wealthy mastered over generations. I started documenting everything. Every whisper. Every shift in behavior. Every moment James seemed to disappear behind that blank, compliant stare. I created a private archive on a secure server, recording timestamps and descriptions, attaching audio snippets whenever I could capture them through the walls of the mansion. I wasn't building a case yet, at least, that's what I told myself. I was just trying to understand what was happening to my husband. The man I married was somewhere inside him. I was certain of it. Then, one evening, something changed. We were hosting a private dinner for the Caldwell Foundation board, and as I greeted guests in the foyer, Eleanor stepped close, her hand sliding around James's arm like a queen guiding her pawn. I watched her lean in, whisper something too soft for anyone else to hear. James's pupils constricted instantly. His jaw tightened. His shoulders squared with military precision. When I asked him a simple question, "Would you like red or white wine?" he didn't answer. He didn't even blink. He simply turned his head toward Eleanor, as though waiting for her to breathe permission into him. That was the moment I stopped hoping this was stress, or pressure, or family influence. This was something engineered. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house returned to its hollow quiet, I confronted him gently. "James, do you remember what your mother whispered to you earlier?" He blinked slowly, confusion flickering but never fully forming. "What whisper?" "We just had dinner." He didn't remember the trigger. He didn't remember freezing. He didn't remember himself. I sat on the edge of the bed long after he fell asleep, staring at him as though he were a stranger wearing my husband's face. The truth settled over me with a cold certainty. Whatever was being done to James, it wasn't accidental. It wasn't emotional manipulation. It was systematic, practiced, and dangerous. And if Eleanor was capable of rewriting her son like this, then the ledger entries I'd found weren't the full story. They were just the beginning. The morning after the board dinner, I woke to the soft hum of the mansion's central heating system and a cold emptiness beside me. James was already gone, a habit that had grown increasingly frequent over the past few months. I sat up slowly, my cheek still faintly tender from where his hand had landed during last night's triggered freeze. He hadn't hit me, not then, but the rigidity of his reaction had left a psychic bruise deeper than any physical mark. I walked to the window, pulling aside the heavy velvet curtains Eleanor had chosen specifically to match the family image. Outside, the estate grounds were dusted with early snow, pristine and controlled, like every inch of the Caldwell legacy. But beneath that immaculate surface, rot had taken root, and I was finally beginning to see how deep it went. Later that day, I visited the Caldwell Archives room, a private library accessible only to family members. Eleanor believed I used it for researching foundation cases, which was partially true, but my real interest lay in what she didn't want anyone to study too closely. I sifted through old financial reports, therapy receipts, school records, and behavioral assessments dating back decades. The deeper I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Generations of Caldwells weren't shaped, they were engineered. Conditioned. Programmed to protect the dynasty above all else. Love, autonomy, joy, those were acceptable casualties in pursuit of the family's continued reign. Then I found something unexpected. An old leather-bound journal belonging to James's late father. Half the pages were torn out, but the ones that remained chilled me to my core. He'd written about Eleanor's methods, about her obsession with obedience, about her belief that emotions could be rewired like circuitry. One sentence kept repeating through the entries: "She will break him to preserve the name." Him. Their son. My husband. My hands trembled as I photographed every page and uploaded it to my encrypted drive. This wasn't just manipulation, it was generational cruelty, passed down like heirloom silver. When James returned home that evening, I tried again to reach him. "Do you ever feel different from who you used to be?" He blinked at me, the delayed response pattern appearing again. "What do you mean?" I studied him carefully. "Like you're following someone else's script instead of your own." His eyes clouded, then cleared mechanically. "My mother just wants what's best. She always has." That answer wasn't his. It was hers, spoken through him. That night, when he fell asleep, I placed a tiny audio monitor beneath the mattress, voice-triggered and encrypted. Within hours, it captured the first clue I desperately needed: James talking in his sleep, whispering phrases like "obey," "recalibrate," "mother knows best," words no child should ever associate with their parents. The next morning, I made my decision. This wasn't just about saving my marriage. This was about saving a man whose autonomy had been stolen before he even reached adulthood. And to do that, I would have to dismantle the Caldwell dynasty from the inside, piece by piece. When I finally accepted that the Caldwell dynasty was built on psychological chains instead of legacy, I began preparing for what would become the most dangerous phase of my plan. I could no longer rely only on hidden recordings or fragmented therapy receipts. I needed undeniable proof, evidence that would stand even if Eleanor tried to destroy me the way she destroyed her own family members. My first move was subtle. I joined the Caldwell Foundation's internal audit team as a supporting legal advisor, a title Eleanor believed would flatter me into obedience. In reality, it granted me access to nearly every encrypted server the Foundation operated. Late at night, long after the household staff had retired, I sat in my private office reviewing files that revealed a sprawling web of financial grooming, donor manipulation, and clandestine payments to behavioral consultants across 3 states. But the most damning discovery came from a folder mislabeled as Youth Outreach Training. Inside were dozens of video clips, grainy recordings of James as a teenager, sitting rigidly in a leather chair while a therapist I didn't recognize tapped a metronome and repeated phrases in a monotone voice. Compliance ensures stability. Emotion creates weakness. The family legacy requires discipline. In clip after clip, James obeyed commands instantly, like a soldier conditioned for war. There were sessions where he cried silently, and sessions where Eleanor stood behind the camera, correcting the therapist's technique with chilling precision. Watching them, my stomach twisted so violently I had to pause the playback several times just to breathe. I copied everything and stored it in a Deadman trigger vault, encrypted with 3 separate authentication methods. If anything happened to me, the entire Caldwell empire would unravel within minutes. That was my insurance, a quiet blade pressed against the dynasty's throat. Over the next several weeks, I noticed something shifting in James. Tiny, flickering cracks appeared in his conditioned composure. Once, during dinner, Eleanor tapped a silver ring against her wineglass, one of his triggers, and instead of straightening obediently, James hesitated. His eyes darted to me, searching for something he couldn't name. That moment lit a spark of possibility I hadn't dared hope for. I began testing gentle boundaries. Asking him questions. Introducing unfamiliar opinions. Encouraging him to recall memories from before Eleanor's influence tightened fully around him. At first his responses were fragmented, uncertain. But gradually, glimpses of the man I once loved resurfaced, his dry humor, his unexpected tenderness, his hunger for independence. The stronger he became, the more erratic Eleanor grew. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone in her study, her voice sharp and trembling with panic. "She's interfering," she hissed. "We need to reinforce the conditioning before the trustees' evaluation. If James fails the psychological stability review, everything collapses. Everything. Not just their influence. Not just their reputation. Their entire financial empire hinged on keeping James compliant." That was the moment I realized something crucial. Eleanor wasn't just dangerous. She was desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. The night before my birthday gala, the night Eleanor believed would cement her dynasty, I sat alone in the guest room, reviewing every final detail of the evidence package queued for release. My entire plan depended on timing, precision, and Eleanor's own arrogance. She had spent years convincing herself that I was ornamental, obedient, incapable of strategy. That blindness was my greatest weapon. Still, beneath my steady breath and calculated calm, a tremor of fear lingered. Not fear of failing, fear of what Eleanor might do if she sensed even a flicker of rebellion. She had conditioned her own son, destroying me would require far less effort. At 2:17 a.m., I received a coded text from Agent Rowan, "Systems primed. Activation confirmed." It meant the Deadman trigger was live. One impact, one forced seizure of my phone, one abrupt biometric interruption, and everything would be released to federal agencies, investigative journalists, and the trustees. The truth was no longer trapped in my hands, it existed everywhere and nowhere, impossible for Eleanor to contain. I slept only briefly before dawn tugged at the curtains. When I entered the kitchen, James was already there, staring into a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His conditioning had always made him calm, controlled, predictable, but now I saw something new, disorientation. And under it, fear. "Elise," he said quietly, "have you ever felt like you've been living someone else's life?" My pulse stilled. His question wasn't random. It was the first time he had articulated anything resembling self-awareness. "Whose life do you think you've been living?" I asked gently. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and rubbed his forehead as though trying to massage memories back into place. "I don't know," he whispered. "But when I try to make decisions on my own, it feels like something pulls me back. A programmed response. A manufactured instinct. A leash disguised as loyalty." Before I could answer, Eleanor swept into the room, wearing her signature silk robe and an expression polished to perfection. Her eyes flicked from James's face to mine, tightening almost imperceptibly. "James, dear," she said in a tone too sweet to be sincere, "don't strain yourself thinking this early. You know it stresses you." A command wrapped in maternal affection. I watched James straighten unconsciously, shoulders stiffening, a triggered response I'd noted dozens of times. But this time, resistance flickered in his eyes before the conditioning smothered it. Eleanor noticed. Her smile sharpened. "We have a very important evening ahead," she continued, circling us like a queen inspecting pawns. "And Elise, I trust you remember your role?" "My role?" I repeated softly. She leaned close enough that I felt her breath warm against my cheek. "To be charming. Grateful. Quiet. Quiet." She wanted silence. She expected obedience. She believed the entire world still bent to her will. She had no idea that tomorrow night, the night she engineered to demonstrate her control, I planned to burn her empire to the ground using nothing but truth, timing, and the very man she thought she owned. And the most exquisite part? She would build the stage herself. The rooftop of the Meridian Club glittered like a jeweled crown above the city, Eleanor's preferred battlefield. From the moment James and I stepped out of the private elevator, the crowd shifted, realigning itself around her like planets orbiting a dying star. Flashing smiles, polished hypocrisy, veiled ambition, Boston's elite had arrived in full regalia, ready to witness whatever spectacle the Harrington matriarch had prepared. They believed they were here to celebrate with me. In truth, they were the final witnesses to her downfall. The scent of jasmine candles drifted through the air, mingling with the sea breeze rising from the harbor. A string quartet played near the railing, notes trembling in the cold wind like secrets desperate to escape. Eleanor approached us, her gown a sweeping masterpiece of navy silk and diamonds. She kissed my cheek with rehearsed affection. "Do behave tonight, Elise," she murmured, fingertips tightening briefly on my arm. "Your image reflects on all of us." Translation: do nothing unexpected. Obey. But tonight, obedience was the one thing I had erased from my vocabulary. As dinner began, I played my role flawlessly. Smiling, conversing, accepting hollow compliments with the poise of a seasoned diplomat. All the while, I watched James, his posture rigid, his eyes flickering with micro-tremors of confusion. The cracks in his conditioning were spreading faster now. Eleanor noticed too. She hovered behind him, subtly adjusting her tone whenever his reactions faltered, applying verbal pressure like a puppeteer tugging frayed strings. But the moment I'd planned for arrived sooner than expected. Right after the second course, Eleanor rose, lifting her champagne glass. "Before dessert," she announced, "I'd like to share something very special about our Elise." The guests applauded, leaning forward like spectators waiting for the curtain to rise. The stage was hers, or so she believed. She placed a hand on James's shoulder, nails grazing his suit fabric with intentional precision. A trigger point. His body stilled, breath shortening. "James," she cooed, "darling, go ahead." His pupils were constricted. His jaw locked. And then, exactly as she had engineered, he turned toward me with an expression stripped of humanity. "You betrayed us," he said flatly. The room fell silent. Eleanor's smile sharpened. Cameras lifted. This was her grand moment, humiliating me publicly, framing me as disloyal, severing my influence before the trust disbursement ruled in her favor. But fate, justice, and technology had other plans. Because the moment his hand struck my face, the moment my body hit the polished floor, that exact impact triggered the accelerometer in my phone. The dead man's switch activated. Across the rooftop, devices began vibrating. Buzzing. Chiming. Brows furrowed. Screens lit up. Alerts spread like wildfire. Breaking news: federal investigation into Harrington family, psychological manipulation, fraud, racketeering. A tidal wave of truth crashing faster than Eleanor could blink. I rose slowly, blood on my lip and triumph in my smile, feeling the weight of decades of their corruption shifting, not onto me, but onto her. And as every horrified face turned toward Eleanor, her empire finally began to crumble.